Good afternoon. Thanks for coming. If you want to follow the talk live, I'm using this online platform. You could do that here. That way you don't have to take as many pictures and you can, bookmark it if you'd like. So yeah, show of hands, who came in this talk because they saw Star Trek in the name? That's what I thought. Okay. That's great. No problem. All right, so we're going to have some fun. I may make you a little bit uncomfortable, but that's okay. Uncomfortable is good. That's how we grow. So yeah, let's get started. All right, so let's play a quick game. A young woman was 3 years old when she started to read books. By show of hands, right? What was her college GPA? Who believes between 3.1 and 3.5? Okay. What about less than a 2.4? Anyone? No? Greater than a 3.9? Okay. 3.6, 3.9? Anyone? Who doesn't want to play this game? It seems like. That's all right. Anyone 2.5, 3.0? So the goal here, the reason I point this out is because that little quick game, what we're really doing is something called bias. And I know a lot of times you've probably heard that word, you think kind of a negative thing, but just think about it in a more objective term, right? You're trying to take something that you understand in the past and then use that as a connection to the future. You can't avoid it. Sure, sometimes it's more negative than others, but the point is that it's a fact of just how our brains are wired. We try to make shortcuts, we try to figure out how to go to the next level based on the limited information that we have. And that quick example just kind of showed that. So there was no right answer. There is a fictional person, don't feel bad. But I just wanted to kind of communicate this idea that bias is a thing. And so, of course, because of Rich's talk, I changed my slides and he said, okay, a good presentation has to have a hypothesis, so I'm going to make one. So my hypothesis for this talk, tech will make the world a better place by requiring equity and emotional intelligence integral to its interoperability. There's a lot of words there. I'm going to try to unpack them. And again, the goal here is not to make anyone feel bad. I'm not trying to beat anyone over the head. The idea is that how can we really think about this similar to how we think about systems problems? How do we break down the combination of what exists in the world, the psychology of how we work, and what does math and science tell us in terms of how we think about the direction we want to go? Everyone still with me so far? Awesome. All right. So the first kind of definitions and little points that I want to kind of throw out there is something called perspective. We kind of all know what perspective is, right? Perspective is how you decide to look at a problem. Something you may not have heard of is something called a heuristic. And a heuristic is how you search for a solution. So when you're trying to find a solution, what's the first thing you probably do? You search for it, right? You go online, you search for it, or you go and search for a person who you think may have the answer, because that's the heuristic you've seen, you've been taught, that's being reinforced, and your skill or your ability or your output and things that you're rewarded is based on how quickly can you get to that problem, right? All right, so a quick story. Picture some cows, because you got to have just slides with just a picture on there. You can't just have words, because then people, get bored. So the quick story is, right, that in the 1930s there was a calf that was sick, and a young farmer was, I'm gonna keep going. A young farmer was trying to figure out why were the cows sick. So they took their calf to an agricultural research center, and after they kind of dissected and kind of extracted some of the food out of the calf's stomach, one of the 7 stomachs, they found this thing called coumarin, which is a clover byproduct. So essentially the young calf was eating clovers. And what they found was that because that coumarin thins the cow's blood, the calf was getting sick because they were eating this, naturally doing what they were doing, and they figured out, okay, you need to probably stop doing that. Again, this is in the 1930s. That particular scientist who found that after a quick stint in the insane asylum decided that this particular byproduct of clovers would be great for rat poison. What's interesting about that story is coumadin, after about 40 years later, is actually the key ingredient to blood thinners. And blood thinners, next to penicillin, are the second most piece of medicine that has saved the most lives, right? The reason why it took so long to even find this discovery was because it was kind of contained within an agricultural research farming context. Within that context, the perspective of the farmer was, I need to figure out how to help my calf. The heuristic of that particular researcher was, okay, well, let's go in, but there was never a connection to how could it help other applications until 40 years later. So just a quick little story on how perspective and heuristic works, and how when you're able to create this interoperable perspectives amongst different groups, you're able to have these really kind of almost exponential impacts on how we all live and the length of our lives and things of that nature. Another quick story. Everyone kind of knows what this is, right? It's a picture of a sperm impregnating the egg. And for the longest time in science, this is how almost everyone was taught how sperm impregnates eggs. It was a single sperm, the best sperm wins, that's how it's done. Well, once they allowed women to become actually scientists, they found out that's not how it's actually done. Lots of sperm actually make it to the egg, and then the egg actually chooses the sperm that decides what is the best fit, which is going to have the best kind of almost natural biological diversity in that particular case. So even in the case where scientists and people who are really smart are trying to teach others how things work, their own particular perspectives and their heuristic within the context of the world that they live in, their bias, had this rippling effect. And it wasn't until the different perspectives were included and considered that our understanding of how biology works changed. All right. Why does this matter, especially at LISA19 conference, and given the fact that I'm actually an outsider kind of coming in? I'm a dev, so I've gone to the keynotes now, I've listened to a bunch of talks, and it seems like you guys don't really like us that much, but that's okay. Why does that matter, I guess, in this particular conference? And, why did I apply to speak at this conference, and why was I awarded one of the diversity scholarships? I'm proud to say that I was awarded one of those diversity scholarships to come and talk about this. It's something I've been thinking about and working on actually for the last 15 years. One of the first talks I ever gave was actually in high school 20 years ago. I went to a majority white high school. We had 2,500 people at our school, 650 people in our graduating class. I was a national recognized orator, and they asked me to speak and give a rousing speech to my high school class. We were the class of 2000. And in that class, even at 17 years old, I started to talk about the world that I wanted to live in and the place that I wanted to be, and how, even though, this is the new millennium, we can figure out how to live with each other and sit next to each other and figure out how to have these conversations because it's the new millennium. So now 20 years later, it's actually kind of interesting, I'll use the word interesting, to be standing here in front of you and kind of taking this research, this constant thing that I've tried to figure out, especially in my dev life, to figure out, okay, everyone feels like their team is great, because if they didn't, they would have fired the people who are on that team. So how do we understand these concepts of perspective, of heuristic, of bias, especially when the words like diversity have been papered over, when people roll their eyes, when people immediately kind of get sensitive because they think, okay, if I'm including more, that means me specifically are getting less. So, of course, your team is full of superheroes. But the one thing we need to basically understand when we think about a team in general is really to understand, what do we mean by diversity? And is it this concrete thing? And is it just, oh, the person looks different than me? And the answer is no. There's actually 3 different kinds of diversity. There's demographic. That's the one we all kind of fight wars over, honestly, right? Our gender, our race, sexual orientation, etc. These are identities of origin. These are the things that we take with us for the rest of our life. We have experiential diversity. This is something, what our affinities are, what we grow to eventually kind of engage with, our hobbies, our abilities. These things are organic, right? We don't want to manage these. We want people to feel comfortable. They gravitate towards things and gravitate towards other people that have those similarities. And different groups who have those different experiences, kind of makes a really cool ecosystem. And then you have this new term, which you've probably heard, which almost kind of gets used as a weapon to kind of beat down the demographic diversity, which is this idea of cognitive diversity. This is how we approach problems and think about things. This is when the conversation typically goes from, well, I don't want to just hire, a woman or a black person or a Hispanic person. I just want someone who thinks differently. We need to achieve cognitive diversity. And we're not going to kind of debate these things. I think the one thing that I want to stress upon you is it's fluid. It's complex. It can be all things at once. There is no such thing as one over the other, but we do recognize that these categories that we have, again, in our current science and the way the current discussion has happened, it's helpful to at least understand these particular buckets so that we can have a good faith conversation of what we mean by diversity. What's interesting about this complex understanding of how we think about diversity is there are so many examples in nature that already reinforce this idea that the concept of diversity is extremely complex. And the picture you're looking at is essentially a frog eating a cricket. As we all know, and what we probably learned in science class, right, is that you have a frog, you have a bug, frogs eat bugs. The way that time kind of works and the way that evolutionary works is that in order for that species of bug to exist moving forward, it maybe has to be a little bit more slippery, a little bit more conniving, so it's not completely eaten. And that particular section or that particular type of bug will move forward because they outwit the frogs who are eating the ones who haven't adapted. The same is true for the frogs as well, right? The frogs who have the stickier tongues, the faster reflexes are the ones who eventually move forward. And so the point is, in order to really kind of understand and get to the goals that we want to all get to, we have to also adapt the idea that this is a constantly evolving thing and standing still isn't an option. Because if you do, you'll die. So now we get to Star Trek. And I know everyone's kind of probably like really disappointed and probably going to start flipping tables because everyone thought I was probably going to do Enterprise or TNG or DS9. And I picked the one that, a lot of people hate. And if you hate it, I invite you to go back on Netflix and actually binge watch. Voyager's really good. I've done it. But for those who are not familiar with the premise of this particular canon, Voyager was set in the 2730s. And the premise was essentially that a particular Starfleet team, I should say, I apologize, Starfleet team and a Rebel Maquis alliance were essentially thrown together 70,000 light years away from their home, and they essentially had to figure out how to get back home together. Because they were both from the Alpha Quadrant where Earth existed, but they were warring within their own particular context. But now this extraordinary circumstance has forced them to work together to move forward. So what you're looking at is a really cool little picture of that amalgamation of different existences trying to solve a common problem. The allegory here is that that's a little bit of what we're trying to do. When you heard the earlier keynote speeches and they talked about how important security is and how it's important for all of us to kind of get into this realm, there was an acknowledgement, a very forceful acknowledgement that, oh crap, we've really messed this up. And it's evident because now we've built all these systems with all this really great ways to do this interoperability data, but now it's being manipulated against us because our security infrastructure isn't in a proper place. And it happens to be because the culture of the people who actually are in charge of disseminating this information have problems within themselves. They've created FUD. So this idea that we're constantly kind of focusing on these really difficult problems is a good premise when we think about, okay, we all have different perspectives and heuristics, but at the end of the day, we're all trying to solve this really hard goal. So let's kind of dive deeper into some of these characters and pull out allegorically what do they mean when we think about the values of teen diversity in general. So we have Captain Janeway, and for the younger folks in the audience, you probably are like, wait a minute, isn't this the woman from Orange is the New Black? And the answer is yes. For some of the older folks, they're like, wait, this wasn't her first primary role, it was actually something else? And the answer is yes. She's been around for a while. But what's great about Captain Janeway, played by Kate Mulgrew, is one, she was the first woman captain in a series that was showcased on prime time, which was really great. And the other thing that was great about her character was she was very out of the box. She was constantly depicted as a bullheaded person, a person who was dogmatic and very impulsive. And given, again, you got to think about kind of the late 80s, the 90s, and the way that TV was controlled by a certain set of executives and producers and certain stations, the idea of recasting, right, particular characters differently from how you understood them was very groundbreaking. Her job as a captain was to meld, again, together a dynamic crew, and what always drove her was this sense of curiosity, this idea that, okay, outside of what I already know, even though I'm very dogmatic and very bullheaded, that I need to constantly be curious or else my crew won't survive. And she would reinforce these principles from I kind of encapsulated in this quote here, where she would say, make sure that as your captain, you keep your shirt tucked in, which means you always want to make sure that you look like you're in control. And at all times, go down with your ship and never abandon a member of your crew. What's really interesting about this particular character is what she is saying is, as a leader, if you are a leader of an organization, you have the greatest opportunity to inflect change. And at the end of the day, when you have team members who may stick their necks out or who may be different than others, at all costs, you have to back them up, or your culture won't change. So it leads to the question, if you're leader of a team, leader of your company, leader of a project, are you open to unorthodox thinking? Are you open to unorthodoxy? So now we introduce kind of our second set, or our third set, I should say, of definitions we need to understand. The difference between IQ and EQ, intelligence quotient, emotional quotient, right? So the most important difference is that IQ is really focused on your ability to learn. It's not about what you know already. It's about the rate, acceleration of not knowing something and getting to a known state. Whereas emotional quotient is your ability to recognize others' emotions as well as your own. Why is that important? Because when you're learning new things, you go through different phases. You go through a phase of frustration, you go through a phase of elation, you go through a phase of collaboration, of unknown, of fear, etc. And so as we think about these concepts of the importance of bringing teams together, collaborating on really hard problems, understanding the difference and not over-indexing on one or the other, one person's ability to know something versus that person's ability to understand how others are feeling as well as themselves as they go through the journey of learning something is really important. What's also interesting from a scientific perspective is that your IQ really doesn't change from your childhood. It's kind of hardwired into your DNA. Whereas EQ is something you can develop. It changes over time, which gives us an opportunity to say, okay, this is something we can actually target, given our goals and the hard problems we're trying to solve. So now we start talking about, okay, can we measure the emotional intelligence of groups, and why is that important? So if you look at some data kind of culled together within Harvard Business Review from, almost, again, 20 years ago, basically the conclusion was, teams who develop greater emotional intelligence boost their overall performance. So if we just kind of take the studies that are buried within that study and say, okay, the baseline is, how do I improve the performance of my group? A recommendation here is to focus on the emotional intelligence of that group. And again, emotional intelligence is what is the perception of the people within that group in terms of how they read other people and how they are self-aware themselves. The way you can measure that is, do the members feel like they can trust each other? Is there a sense of group identity? And is there a sense of group efficacy? And what I loved about the previous talk was, as I said, I've been doing these kind of discussions for 20 years. And so even 8 years ago when I went to the O'Reilly conference and had kind of the same conversation. It's really interesting to see, and actually really pleasurable to see, companies and leaders actually talk about the importance of the people ops portion of what they're actually doing and making sure those emotional rewards are there. At the heart of these conditions, again, are emotions, and the ability to listen becomes paramount. Now I move on to Tuvok. And as I keep going forward, I'm going to take a little quick personal privilege. What's really awesome about Tuvok was he was really one of the first characters, again in a primetime series, where a black person was depicted as not as in a typical role. He was 300 years old. He was always projected as a voice of reason and calm, hyper intelligent, and was the most trusted advisor of the captain. And again, as a young man, that was very revolutionary. The one thing that's really interesting about his character is that he constantly talks about that just because he is composed doesn't mean that what he's doing is easy. You cannot mistake composure for ease. And the reason I bring that up is because just because something is difficult, and just because there may be some high tension, very loud conversations or some uncomfortabilities, right? The goal is to focus on the logic, but focusing on the logic and everyone being calm and trying to have these conversations doesn't negate the fact that you should try to go towards an easy conversation. So let's kind of unpack what is the logical solution. And the logical solution is, okay, if I'm trying to build a better team, if I'm trying to get the most out of my team, it's not so much a focus on how smart the individual people are. It's really about, do they actually work and listen with each other? And this is where people start to shift in their seats, at least in the last 10 years that I've done this, right? And one of the pieces of research that I kind of pulled out, with apologies to my folks in the room who don't identify in a binary fashion, I'm just using the data that I was able to find, is that women are key to smart teams. And as a man with privilege, I think it's really important for me to call this out and leverage what I have, especially given my background, to specifically put a fine point that there is data out there specifically that may not show a causation relationship, but there's a high correlation between increasing the emotional intelligence of your team and your company with hiring more women on your team. A lot of this research kind of came out of Carnegie Mellon and MIT, and as you can see, it was in the last 10 years. But again, the focus is on doing things in groups. It used to be, when you wanted to solve hard problems, you would rely on kind of one person. As a matter of fact, when the Nobel Prize was started giving out, almost up until the 1960s, Nobel Prizes were exclusively given to one person. But recently, as you've probably seen, right, they're giving a Nobel Prize and they're dividing it up between groups. And then you also hear, other people in the group are like, oh, I got hosed, right? I didn't get the Nobel Prize. She didn't get it as well. And it basically is reinforcing this idea that the problems that we are tackling today are too big for one person. So relying on an individual's output, again, is something we have to evolve past. Focusing on the group cohesion, the ability to actually have a higher performing group with these harder problems, i.e. the security part that Rich was talking about, reinforces this principle. And so we end up having these conversations that, obviously this is a caricature, but it makes it difficult, right, when you have situations or you have contexts where there's obvious blind spots within decision makers, but they're not using evidence-based data to recognize, okay, how can we do better, until it's too late. So the question then becomes, okay, well, why is that true? Why do diverse teams outperform? And there's some really kind of common basic ideas of why this is the case. The first is, when you're working with people who are not like you and are different than you, you tend to focus on facts because you don't necessarily jump to the heuristic of wanting that person's approval. Because they're different, you don't really know them. And that focus on facts causes you to pause and causes you to actually have a conversation, right? And get that other person's perspective. It almost alters the behavior of that social majority kind of, dominant thinking. The other thing is that it causes you to process facts a little bit more carefully. So even in our natural kind of brains, right? When I'm listening to someone like you're listening to me, and I look a lot different than a lot of people out in the audience, right? You tend to kind of a little bit be more skeptical of what I'm saying, and then you're going to try to check up on my facts to understand, okay, what is actually happening? That then causes you then to say, okay, how do I get more innovative based on these facts that I'm getting? I'm going to try to speed up here. So the bold statement that I'm going to throw out there, number one, is there's no such thing as common sense. We have to almost let go of this notion that there's a common understanding of how things should work. And again, be unorthodox and be open to the idea that there are a lot of different ways that different things can work. All right, let's get to B'Elanna Torres. B'Elanna Torres was a fascinating character within Star Trek because, one, she was half Hispanic and she was almost divided amongst different species. She was human and she was Klingon. What's also interesting is that her strong sense of honor and guilt constantly played on the dynamic of the group because she was very determined to prove herself all the time. In fact, she would constantly challenge herself over and over again to reinforce her sense of being there. Which then leads the question, okay, how are you evaluating talent? There's a book, if you're interested, to check out by a professor, he's a behavioral economics professor called The Difference. And he puts out a lot of different hypotheses and theories that talks about how to incorporate more fact-based and scientific approaches to thinking about recruiting different types of talent. Typically, when you have these conversations, the overarching statement that's constantly pushed is, well, I just want to hire the most qualified. And what's often missed from this statement is, how do you define most qualified? And the blind spot then becomes, what is the perspective and heuristic that you're using from your experiences that then reinforce what you believe most qualified is? Again, you're trying to bring in someone to your organization or group people into your organization to change the world, to accelerate the profitability, to solve the hard problems. Yet, if you have a homogeneous and monolithic way of thinking, then that perspective and heuristic may cause you to miss things that you literally can't even see. So bold statement number 2. You must change your perspective to arrive at a new heuristic. And to do that, that's what innovation actually is. These are some examples of innovation failing. When Ambien first came out, they didn't actually use women to test their pills. They just said, okay, we'll just apply the dosages to smaller men. That's pretty much the same thing. And they almost killed themselves as a company. When Apple Health Kit first came out, they did not provide period tracking, yet they touted the fact that this was the most revolutionary application of monitoring one's health, yet they somehow excluded half the entire population of the planet. How is that possible? Yet it's the most innovative thing. I'm sure you've seen the news about the recent affirmative action case and Harvard's lauded admissions processes, and in that they found that 48% of the white applicants from Harvard actually come from legacy, sports, or donors. And if they would have gone through the typical processes, 70% of them would have actually not made it into the university. And then the last one is just my own personal opinion because I haven't been on Facebook in like 3 years. But I think the newsfeed innovation is, All right, 7 of 9, a controversial figure. For those who are not familiar, 7 of 9 was a formally assimilated Borg. And Borg, within the ecosystem, actually kind of encapsulates exactly what we're sort of talking about, this idea that there's this race of beings where their sole mission is to be the perfect being, and the best way to do that is to essentially assimilate every other type of being and then discard the things they don't think is important. This idea that the only thing that matters is winning and survival. And so if there are things that we don't believe are crucial to winning and survival, those things will need to be pushed out. She was constantly challenged because her response to most things, especially given the crew she was part of, was recognizing that the things that she didn't think were important actually became important given the goal that she had. Her origin story was that she was a young woman who worked for scientists who were studying the Borg, and she was eventually kidnapped by the Borg and turned into the Borg. And so her goal was to become more human. It's something that we've actually kind of heard multiple times, literally in the last couple of hours. Alice has talked about that we need to make better decisions and have better conversations. Rich has focused on this idea that it's actually not about security and the actual tools you're using, it's about the people themselves. Being more human, creating an atmosphere where we all collaborate together. So then that begs the question. You came to this talk, and a lot of people didn't, and that's okay, but why should you care? Why should you care about the diversity of your team? Why should you get itchy, like I get itchy sometimes when I walk into a space and I'm the only one? Why is that important? Some of you may say, you know what? The goal of making our company better is because I just think it'll be great. I'll be able to put it on my resume. And that's fine. Sometimes people do things because they think it makes sense and they want to say that they're helping and saving the world. But there's really kind of two things that really drive people. And that's fear and profit. Those are the two bigger things that really drive these actions. So I'm going to focus on those last two because the first two kind of I don't have enough time, basically. So I'm going to focus on the last two. So from a fear and profit perspective, let's just now start getting into the math. There's a theorem out there that said diversity trumps ability theorem. And the conditions for this theorem are very simple. The problem must be hard. Each solver has to have their own local optima to the problem, which means they have to have a reasonable sense of intelligence to be able to solve the collective problem. An improvement can be made on the solution. So we're not talking about how to explain 2 + 2 = 4 better. That's a simple solution. We're talking about very difficult problems that can be optimized. The other important thing is that there's a large pool of solvers that can eventually kind of get to this particular collection of solutions. So without that, the diversity trumps ability theorem doesn't work. This is an actual mathematical equation. And what's interesting about this, and I don't want to skip this, this is not a feeling, right? This isn't about that people believe diversity trumps ability. This is a mathematical fact similar to the Pythagorean theorem, all right? Technically, if you want to Google it on your own, it's called the diversity prediction identity. And basically, what the equation that you're looking at is saying one simple thing, that a whole bunch of people kind of each make a prediction, and that you essentially average that prediction on the first part. The error of that group equals the average error of the people in the crowd minus the diversity of predictions. And the goal is to have as small an error as possible. So the accuracy of a group's prediction or their output or their efforts, right, is based on that group's ability minus the difference in the categories that the individuals create, which means if they're homogeneous, the difference is going to be small. You still with me? So this isn't really about the fact that, okay, diversity is a good thing. If you are not following the laws of math and physics, again, from the fear perspective, you will not have a high-performing group, and high-performing groups who aren't able to solve complex problems will die. Of course, this paper has a counter, which is great, because in any scientific process, you always want to have a countering opinion. And what's great is that there's a counter to that opinion as well. So if you want to go deep into the math and the hypothesis, I encourage you to do that. What this model essentially tells us is that you have to think of people as a collection of tools. Their ability is a reflection of the applicability of those tools to solve a given set of problems. And so if you think about how we define different types of diversity and their fluidity, instead of looking at it as, okay, this person's different, and if we include more people, that is less for others, we have to start thinking about, okay, what are the tools that I'm missing? And if a problem arises, like the security problem, do we have the people to solve that particular set of problems? And the first thing you should be looking at, again, based on that mathematical theorem, the diversity identity hypothesis, or the theorem I should say, is what is the diversity of the people who are trying to solve this problem? Bold statement number 3. The pipeline problem of talent is actually an incentive problem of industry. It actually isn't about whether there's enough people out there. It's that there are not enough incentives to get over the psychological barriers that people have to make these type of decisions. So I'm running out of time. I'm going to kind of go through these things really, really quickly. Can anyone tell me what this is? These are carabiners. The first one was designed by a human being. The second one was designed by artificial intelligence and is 75% lighter. And the third one was 3D printed and is 50% lighter. The point of this is that in order to get the most effectiveness out of a diverse group, you have to be able to provide an atmosphere where they're able to understand each other, because that's the biggest barrier to diversity. Bringing a bunch of people together and they don't know how to engage each other, which then reinforces the point I made at the beginning. How do you develop a culture that allows for that efficiency? That is the importance of having a high emotional quotient within the team. And I'm hoping that by presenting it in this very kind of laid out objective manner, we focus on this principle. It's not really about hitting something that no one else can hit and out competing another team. It's about the value of being able to accomplish and look for things that you don't even see, being uncomfortable. Not sure why it keeps doing that. Maybe it's telling me something. To wrap it up. All right, real quick. Diversity is a fact. The fact that there are diverse people in this world, you can't change that. What you can change is how do you create a practice of inclusion with the goal of equity. Typically, the conversation kind of falls in this scale. People want to be neutral, some resist inertia, and others want to grow. Some of that looks like integration in social situations, right? And the opposite of that is segregation. If you're around people who are homogenous and you're choosing not to be in integrated spaces, you're actively segregating, or you're kind of staying in neutral. The same is true for the conversation of privilege. The opposite of privilege is not denying that the privilege exists. The opposite of privilege is actually oppression. And we all kind of sort of know our history, and we know which groups have been oppressed. So, quick things you can do on your team to grow. Connect various recruiting metrics to compensation each quarter. SMART goals. Everyone knows what SMART goals are, right? Time-bound, simple, throwing you really simple things you can do as a team. Second thing, document and send monthly top 3 challenges and tech stack use to a NSBE chapter or a SWE chapter. NSBE is the National Society of Black Engineers. It's the largest student-run organization in the country. SWE is the Society of Women Engineers. Pretty simple to do. Maybe swap out your free code Fridays instead of just individual tasks. Maybe you have a collection of people taking and doing postmortems of what you've done and then sending that out as case studies. What that does is that you've created exposure and access to a group that is outside of your purview for them to understand what you're about. Almost done. All right. Last thing you can do as a team, follow at least 3 devs of color, women, or non-binary folks and try to have the discussion over lunch. If you want to do something personal, there's really just kind of 2 things that I recommend. 1, try to get out of the prove me wrong mentality and start asking more questions. What am I missing? You may be right. You may know exactly what you know. But instead of going into it as prove me wrong, just ask the question, what could I be missing? That simple turn of phrase, you'd be surprised, can help you develop a higher emotional quotient. And then the other one, focus on being successful versus right. Constantly reinforce what is the goal versus just constantly feeling like, okay, I need to be reinforced of what I already know. Another thing you could do, if you want, is subscribe to this newsletter. It's something that I'm trying. If you're interested, we can talk about it. So in conclusion, to solve difficult problems, you need people with different ability, and you need diversity, people with different tools. But more importantly, they need to be complemented with a high degree of emotional intelligence. If you want some additional stories, you can definitely check that out. Thanks for listening. I appreciate it.
All right, thank you, Fredric, for a great talk. I got a lot out of it. I think we have time for a question or two if anybody has any questions. And in the meantime, while people are thinking whether or not they have questions, can I just get a round of applause for our awesome live caption person? All right, looks like no questions, so thank you very much, Fredric, and it is now lunchtime.